Greetings and welcome back to another discussion. Today I'm joined by a very smart gentleman by the name of Coyote, and he has a lot to say on a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and I think, and mine for that matter, and should be ideally to many, many people, if not virtually everybody, and that is something I've talked about oftentimes, the cognitive divide, and something I've mentioned less, but the emergence of essentially a new phenotype where society is being stratified to a degree that you're getting the emergence of what you could almost call new cultural subspecies that have no interaction whatsoever and no ability to relate to each other whatsoever, which is causing massive problems. So, I could offer my sales pitch on that, and I probably will, but I think I'm going to hand the podium over to Mr. Coyote first to hear what he has to say about it. So what do you think about that? That seems to me to be one of the most salient problems of our time.
I actually do. I think that's the primary conflict, and like the foundational, one of the prime factors as a foundational motivation in a lot of the conflict that goes on. And you can sort of see it, I think, as a prime example around various political debates that involve some sort of moral judgment. So things like gun control or abortion, when you hear the two sides arguing against each other, they keep calling to their set of values, their moral structure, and argue, well, of course I'm right. Clearly this is the moral structure, and by this moral structure I'm right. And they can't even quite conceive that there's somebody has a different moral structure and therefore could come to a different conclusion. You further see it in how upper middle class and lower upper class has this disdain for the labor class because, as I experience it, they can't quite grasp the cognitive capacity of the labor class, like what they're capable of. So when you start getting things like this blank slate theory of anybody can be retrained into a brain surgeon or a rocket surgeon or whatever, they can't quite grasp that that may not actually be possible, and they can't seem to disconnect that from a moral or value judgment of the human being as an individual. Like, they can't seem to rectify somebody might have a limited capacity, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're any less worth as a human being.
Now, you've worked in tech for a very long time, and from what I understand, you've dealt with all sorts of people. Would you say that, I guess, straddling both sides, well, obviously you're a very smart guy, but in terms of just movement, having to occasionally make forays into one side or the other, and everywhere in between, would you say that allows you a perspective that somebody who is only on one side of the fence simply can't grasp? And what has allowed you? I know, I think my first interaction with you, I might have made the false accusation that, something that I find very common, that, I wouldn't put it this way necessarily for you, but, someone might be too smart for their own good, in the sense that they cannot, as you pointed out, they just can't get that. I've met these people, that somebody who might not be smart enough to do X or get what they're talking about, and it's just this almost invisible barrier that they're just not seeing. But I imagine, you being involved in tech and also in management positions, you've worked with relatively, I guess, dumb people and quite smart people and everything in between. How do you think you've sort of arrived this, or your own experiences reflect this divide?
Well, I think that's maybe where I need to expand on that a little bit, because where I think a lot of my experience of dealing with the sort of people we're talking about, and I'm really not trying to fall into the trap of those people, but is prior to that, I had come up through a fairly shady background operating as effectively a professional informant for the darker parts of the net. So mostly I just hung around doing fairly harmless stuff online and finding guys that were doing far more nefarious stuff and turning them in for any sort of reward, compensation, however that could work. And that sort of just grew into further physical penetration testing for security systems and such. And having to interact with that sort of criminal class, even the ones that were smart enough to pull off some fairly tricky and impressive hacks, they just they lacked something in their reasoning capacity to be able to put together that, if you just, maybe, I don't know, not do this incredibly risky stuff, you could actually have a decent life. You don't need to do all of this to get ahead, guys. It's actually much more productive if you just get with the system. And you kind of see this the same way with, I remember, especially throughout the 80s, hearing stories from the friends of my parents when we would be at those sort of social functions that were also business networking functions about various, stock traders or investment bankers that were going away for some sort of embezzlement scandal, and you'd find out the numbers. You're like, they stole $250,000? Shit, they make that in 5 years. What is wrong with them? That is not screw your life money. That's what are they thinking? And this kind of extends to this sort of almost regardless of socioeconomic class. There's just this class of people that can't quite grasp the concept of screwing over the system is not in your best interest. However much like it look like it's in your best interest now, it's a bad idea in the long run. I mean, the sort of people that are manipulating their lives to get the most welfare possible. And if you try to present them as like, you could have a better life, one that is even likely more satisfying with a quite respectable job, here's a trade school, here's all the stuff, they can't break out of this essentially social conditioning. I usually term it as programming. And that's, you see this kind of regardless of socioeconomic class and even up to a certain level of IQ. That's why earlier in our conversation, when I was making the point of IQ is good, but there's still something about cognitive capacity that we haven't quite quantified that identifies the difference between someone that is able to think abstractly and succeed under a variety of systems because they have an aptitude at abstract thinking, which is good for general problem solving, which means they'll be successful under any system, regardless of what that is, so long as there's a path to success, versus someone that can actually look at the system they're being presented and see how, rather than dealing with the problem that's presented to them, reorganize the system so the problem can no longer occur. And understanding that there is a broader system above that, and sort of moving past a ethical judgment of that and just sort of accepting, well, this is how things work, and if you want a certain outcome, you have a limited set of options in producing that outcome. Some of them might be distasteful. You can decide that's not worth the price and decide that's not the outcome, that's not the price you're going to pay to get that outcome. It's entirely possible you might not be able to get that outcome. If you don't have the cognitive capacity to identify that it all comes down to manipulating the system as a whole, not just responding to the system, is really the true path to success in any sort of evolutionary driven system, then you're just going to kind of be stuck in a rut. And that's kind of what I see we have now, where we've reached a tipping point in civilization where it is now more profitable to game the system than to actually be productive in the system.
Yeah, I can't help. I mean, maybe it's just a point of contention or my own misinterpretation, but I do think that, there are other factors that go. I mean, IQ is just a proxy for G and, G factor, general intelligence. There are other factors like personality traits. I mean, obviously. So, for example, To speak to your example of the guy who just embezzles lots of money, it's entirely possible because all sorts of combinations. You can be really smart and savvy and be really impulsive and too risk friendly, maybe in that sense, and then you can end up with that sort of behavior. And obviously, success requires a combination of the right personality traits, the right intelligence, and all these sorts of things. On the point of gaming the system, I think this speaks to, above all, the lack of interconnectedness that people just observe in their lives, lack of community, that's more broadly, that people don't see themselves as part of, they are cogs, right? But they don't see themselves as part of the greater machinery. And that, I don't even think it's an illusion, really, because it sort of is true. There's that lack of interconnectivity, which to my mind drives a lot of that, because, you're just some guy and there are billions of people and the internet is a vast and wide place, and that would be my take on at least one of the major reasons why we're getting this sort of game the system, and even smart people, at least in part, we talked about this on the TFM server, the noblesse oblige, the concept that if you're in a quote-unquote privileged position, you need to lead by example. But there's no incentive because people are not connected to each other in any way, any relevant way that we used to be, at least.
Yes, and I'm glad that you brought up the noblesse oblige, because yes, that the concept I've been trying to push in my own discussions a bit, because I often run into a barrier when talking about elites, because there's just not a good common term for trying to identify, not talking about the actual political leaders. That's not the term for elite here. The term is one, kind of what Machiavelli describes as a conscious leader, one that can understand, okay, I'm able to understand that there is a system to manage all of these people in a mutually beneficial and productive way. So it's sort of my responsibility that I have the ability to see the system and help manipulate the system to try to do just that. Because in some cases, if you leave people to make their own choices, they're going to make very, very bad choices that hurt not only themselves and others. That's why I would that's why I would take as feedback your point of possibly what I'm trying to quantify or identify is that relationship between IQ and maybe the big five personality trait as the model expressing itself in different ways and bringing out a certain disposition or mindset that would facilitate one being this noblesse oblige capable leader and understanding, I'm kind of responsible for maintaining a system that keeps everyone satisfied to the point that they aren't discontent. And the point you bring up is, I kind of see how socialism, a lot of times you get folks in the right or even somewhat, moderate people talking about how conservatives or communism is kind of a moral failing. And I see it more as a symptom of a failing of the overall system, because they do kind of have a point when they talk about workers being alienated from the fruits of their labor. They're just not processing or describing the situation properly, or maybe coming up with a good solution. Because I can totally acknowledge that, yes, there is a visceral difference between the experience of, I have worked day after day, working the wood, gluing, nailing, sanding, putting all of this labor with my hands and producing a table. As I did it, I got the intermittent reward of seeing a table come into shape. I got the visceral feedback of labor put in is having an effective change on the world, versus the modern structure, whether it's factory or office work, of I showed up, did some stuff, and 2 weeks later I got a paycheck. I certainly don't feel like I'm getting the fruits of my labor. And even if I do say that, it's a little hard to deal with the reality of, are the fruits of my labor really worth like $15 an hour? Jeez. And I'm being generous when I say $15 an hour. I mean, a lot of places in the US, you're looking at like, what, $8 an hour? It's kind of a harsh reality to say, yep, your labor is worth this much.
Yeah, yeah, and then, I mean, I'm not a craftsman myself. I wish I were, but I can only the closest approximation to that is I used to do art, something like that, or even in terms of say role playing games, computer games. You're building a reasonably difficult game. You're building a character from the ground up, investing the time. Some of this can be enormously complex. I mean, that same feeling. Of course, it's you're not getting paid for it. Uh, I think that the modern environment promotes a slightly different phenotype for the quote unquote elite than the ones of old. I think that the degree of ruthlessness required to be successful, I mean, this is well documented in CEOs, that, psychopathy, or at least some sort of tendency in that direction is much more prominent when people like that. That amorality is, because if you're, let's say your job is to increase shareholder profits as well as your own. Anything that stands in the way of that is going to be really a hindrance, best case scenario. Not having some of these impediments, even if it's not, forget about the legal matter here, but there are plenty of ways you can circumvent legality and still end up harming lots of people. It just doesn't really matter because that's your goal, and that type of elite is not an elite with either a moral conscience or one that feels particularly connected to people. He's connected. I mean, he has a goal, a task, a telos, so to speak, and he's going to follow that through to the end. Obviously, he has to work and operate within the boundaries of some sort of legal structure, but to the extent that he can circumvent that, or he can get the job done within it or without it, doesn't. I mean, and this seems to be pretty typical. I mean, that's obviously sort of the CEO mentality. Like a guy like Andrew Wilson, the head of EA, horrible publishing company, especially as gaming goes, but he's still there. So I guess he's doing a good job, and the shareholders are satisfied. Maybe because of FIFA. This just seems to just run through most of the modern elite, which creates another problem, creating connectedness because connectivity. Why would you be if in that case if you're person? Because yeah, it is enormously complex. Again, it's not just this combination of personality traits. It's going to take a long time for us humans to really nail down all the combinations and all the variables that can lead to potential. And then the environmental interactions that lead to different outcomes. But one gets the impression that the leaders of old, whether they were leaders that were military leaders or what have they had a different sense of moral compass than quote unquote leaders of today, who, as you point out, are much more inclined to game the system. The ruthlessness doesn't, and this is anecdotal, I'm sort of speculating, it doesn't seem to be at the same level as what we see in today's lead. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, what you're describing is the need for another Cincinnatus, effectively, and that's lovely and all, but that's kind of where I think the socialists didn't go quite far enough, because they talked about the workers being disaffected, alienated from the fruits of their labor. Yes, that is a problem. Great, we can talk about dealing with that. But they did not then flip that around and contend with the problem like you're describing, which is the managers being disconnected from the laborers they're supposed to manage. Hence, you can end up with scenarios like offshoring work becomes viable, outsourcing work becomes reasonable, because the system is set up such that the feedback the leaders are getting is positive, so they can take action that is, by pretty much every metric, detrimental to their more immediate community or the larger community that they're ostensibly a part of. But the practical feedback they get of, I am still making money, my life is still satisfactory, and no one's trying to kill me, means they're not getting the feedback they need to understand this is bad.
Right. Well, that was part of the example I brought up in the TFM context of, this is going way back, but feudal interdependencies, everyone was important, and you could not completely ignore the concerns of serfs. I mean, sure, you had authority. Probably could even put a couple of, you could remove them from the world, to use a euphemism, but there's still, those interdependencies were there in a way, and I think that's a good word to use, ostensible, the ostensible community. It seems to me it's more seeming than anything else. They're not really part of the community. And I think to get back to the idea of sort of cognitive devices, you wouldn't disagree that intelligence is a hugely important factor in all of this. That when you can talk about things and think about things and entertain things that of a certain level, abstractions, and other people, huge swaths of people can't even fathom what's going on. For example, what is it like? You can experience this. What is it? Simple concept. What is it like not to be able to follow a conversation? Assuming you speak the language, maybe it's English, native, whatever. Well, there are types of conversations I know I couldn't follow, probably due to just lack of information. So if there were some really technical conversation about electrical engineering, I'd understand all the words, but I wouldn't be able to assign categories or make sense of it. That's one area. You could say a person lacks specialization, therefore they can't participate or they can't really follow. But then there's a broader conversations where a whole host of factors. One of the reasons why I could tell you were smart initially, it was because of your addiction. Now, that's not always a dead giveaway, and can be a bit of fakery involved, though I'm certainly not attributing that to you. But that's a good hint. And then, so you have conversations that can be about broad generalities, that they have a certain lexicon, they have a certain flow, and generally speaking, even if I couldn't participate myself, say a conversation about physics, can follow most of it. And so even I struggle, what's it like to not be able to just follow a certain basic conversation at all? And I'm not talking about, like tech jargon, because most of us are specialists in something, or can talk about something in a way that renders it completely inaccessible and just bamboozles people because they don't. But just broadly, and I think that's the issue. There's a kind of a level of discourse, which is reflective of a whole bunch of level of abstract thinking, which you mentioned, that is not accessible to people, and we just assume that most people can follow it. And I got my first hint of this directly when, after having worked in an office for a while, I, the second time in my life, did, for a much longer period, blue-collar work, doing various things in a warehouse for a couple of years. Sometimes it was, putting labels on granola bars. Sometimes it was, carrying crates, putting boxes on, whatever, that sort of thing. The people I worked with, I'd listen to their conversations, and I'd try to participate, and did my best, and they were nice enough people. But when I started talking about things, it was not me going off on some special folk. It just, I wouldn't say this. For example, I'll give you an example where I tried to explain macronutrients and nutrition, and just that this could have an effect, and they couldn't. And so I tried to explain, and it just wasn't going through. It wasn't really very technical, and I got a lot of hints of that, and I realized that exists. It's a real thing, and maybe even a large number of people might fall into that category. And so the things people talk about, I mean, think about the relationship of quote unquote Washington to the rest of the United States. It's hyper technical for one. The language, it's very detailed. Most of the time the politicians don't even know what they're talking about, I guess. I mean, I can only imagine that fundamentally not being able to comprehend the world around you, as a lot of these people, unfortunately, through no fault of their own disposition, what you're supposed to do about that and not fall into despair, I'm not really sure. Because there are no options. I mean, there was a gentleman earlier who said, oh, they need to, rally and do this and that, but they don't even understand what's going on, is my impression. They're just completely lost. Oh, sorry.
Yes, I would generally agree, because we even have to acknowledge that people, creators on YouTube like yourself, content consumers of YouTube like myself, the SJWs reading BuzzFeed, talking on Twitter, we're all in this incredibly hyperactive, self-resonating, harmonizing series of echo chambers that is just reverberating back and forth across each other, and the vast majority of the rest of the world has no inkling of what is going on. That's why, as much as people talk about, oh, don't doubt yourself, they're so terribly worried about it, them tracking you down where it is, like, yeah, the vast majority of the world would not understand what is going on if they even got such a phone call. They wouldn't grasp the concept. Like, they don't know what BuzzFeed is. How the hell is BuzzFeed supposed to put any pressure on them when they literally don't know who they are? I've encountered this because most of my work is around more the financial services sector and such, and talking with these quote-unquote normies, they literally don't know the debate going on around online censorship. It's just not in their sphere. They have no idea what's going on.
Yeah, although I wonder in those cases if that probably less to do with some cognitive limitation and more to do with it just, if you...
I would agree.
Yeah, if you don't...
It is very much that it's not sort of in their stream, so they're just not getting the information. But I guess maybe a better example of the cognitive dissonance would be very much like why I cannot talk about the abortion debate with really anyone, because pretty much in my experience, but damn near everyone I've ever tried to talk to about it falls on one side or the other. Pro-choice, pro-life, fine, whatever. But they're all hung up on the various rhetoric around that. You have the pro-life people, they're on their rhetoric of it is a human life, you are murdering people. Right. You have the other side that is saying that it's not, it's a bundle of cells, and I can't talk with either of them because I bring up the question of like, okay, what defines human? Let's discuss what defines human before we even get to the level of, is this a murder or not? Before we get to the value judgment of this, is this an acceptable murder? Like, first we have to agree on what is human, and we have a hard enough time defining that amongst each other as communicative adults. Now we're trying to bring a fetus into the equation? Like, good luck. Philosophers have been wrestling with this conundrum for pretty much the dawn of speech.
Yeah. Well, I have the same issue.
Civilizations term themselves as the people.
Yeah, I have the same issue on that particular topic, just because I'm not emotionally attached to it whatsoever. I happen to be pro-choice, but that's born largely a pragmatic observation that, I mean, I don't really want to reduce it to this, but basically you could outlaw abortion all you want. You're still going to get back alley abortion. Still going to get people really want to do it. You might reduce the number. They're still going to do it. You're not going to actually prevent it from happening. And to the extent that happens, you're creating more danger. You're going to be, quote unquote, taking two lives oftentimes in sort of the back alley abortion scenario. This is, abortions in various forms have been with us since prehistory. They're not going away. But again, people are, sure, someone on pro-choice will start to say, oh yeah, that's a good, but both, I agree with you, have a kind of emotional, moral attachment to the issue that isn't particularly helpful. And yeah, they're not. Well, people don't like to define things to begin with. I mean, so many conversations you see amongst wedge issues, really any issue, but wedges in particular. They don't define the terms. I mean, I've had this has happened to me too in discussions about things like determinism. What do you mean? There's and with friends that go on for 2 or 3 hours, and then you find out towards the end that in actuality, to give an equivalent, I was talking about dogs and he was talking about cats, and so we've just maybe not wasted 2 or 3 hours, but we're fundamentally talking about different animals here, and so defining in term, which would be really helpful, but I suppose there's people have their predefined definitions. That's a bit redundant, but yeah, and what do you do about that? That would be really helpful for all discourse to define what you mean and then work with that. But nobody does that. That would be the case of abortion. That would be the case of just about anything that warrants discussion.
Well, I've been able to use it as kind of a filtering mechanism of whether or not I should bother talking with someone, or if I am, what level I can have a discourse with them on, is just sort of doing that check of, okay, if I even present a question about the viability of your moral structure, do I just get a programmed response telling me I'm effectively evil? Okay, then I can't really talk to you. There's just nothing, there's not enough cognitive energy going into any conversation that individual is having to really have a productive conversation. I know that might sound like kind of a brutal assessment, but I think there's a variety of factors that can go into it, whether it's they just lack some innate cognitive capacity, whether it's been effectively diminished by very poor upbringing and poor social programming. But it's I see similar points on the gun control debate. In both of those cases, trying to enter into something like the abortion debate of, like, look, I'm not taking a side necessarily. I'm trying to question what your goal is. Like, what you are in favor of banning abortion, you're in favor of making it more liberally available. Okay, what is your stated goal, and how does this work towards that end? And they can't even, like, they can't conceive of this as part of a broader plan. Similar thing with gun control. Like, I can't understand the people that rail about how the Trump administration is evil, terrible fascists that hate everyone else that isn't like them, and yet they also want to give their guns to this same government. It's like, clearly there is something lacking here, that they can't even think through the rationale of some of their arguments and how they contradict each other.
Well, if they want to specify, they could say, look, I want to, I guess in this case, give my guns to the Obama government, but not the Trump government, or something like that, I guess is what you're referring to. Essentially.
Yeah, I suppose, but that's sort of what I'm getting at, is they can't understand the broader point of, like, do you not grasp how ceding that power to a central authority makes that central authority a prime target for acquisition and therefore the goal of abuse? Like, this is part of the reason why I'm opposed to socialism. It's not on any ethical grounds. And if you want to talk about redistributing wealth through force as a means to an end, and you make a good case that it's a reasonable, productive means to the end, sure. I mean, maybe we're talking about, like, the last 10 people on a lifeboat, and sorry, Billy, but we're definitely going to be raiding your knapsack there to divvy up the rations for everybody. Don't give a shit that they're yours. Maybe that's an appropriate situation to be sort of socialist or communist like that, but it just comes down to, I'm sorry, but you're proposing a system that is ripe for abuse, and it just seems that some people just can't grasp how the policies they're enacting will play out. They can't see the consequences and series of cause and effect. It's sort of like the distinction of chess masters. A grandmaster, chess master, whatever the term is able to think several moves ahead by envisioning all the possible outcomes, and AI is better at it because it can just predict more moves ahead. I'm sort of seeing that in what we're identifying as this cognitive dissonance. It's a combination of what IQ is measuring, which is sort of this metric of abstract problem-solving capability, abstract thinking capability, and this other almost more conscious knowledge of systems and ability to almost amorally weigh the utility of any proposed system based on the desired outcome, and just sort of brutally accept that sometimes shit needs to happen. I think a prime example that I love to bring up is the golden path that Frank Herbert wrote about in the Dune series.
I vaguely recall that. It's been eons, but certainly the audience probably wouldn't be necessarily familiar, so maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah, certainly. In the Dune series, not to get too far into the lore of it, but to give a little bit of background, there is a substance, the spice. I'm sure people have heard of it in memes. One of the attributes of the spice is, if consumed enough quantities in individual gains, as they term it, prescience, essentially future sight. It's always described in the books as this kind of abstract knowledge of how various interplay of events can cause an outcome. So it's not so much that you know exactly what the future will be, but you're able to see how all the possible moves will play out, and having this sort of near omniscient knowledge of how various decisions will play out, you can do the thing that gets you the outcome you want. And this builds up to the main character in the beginning of the series, Paul, who through various in-world mystical mumbo-jumbo, ends up gaining perfect prescience all the way to the end of time. And in seeing this, he sees that there's really only one course of action that humanity can follow to be able to survive in perpetuity, effectively. All other paths lead to humanity's ultimate extinction one way or another. And thus, this path that would lead to humanity being able to survive, essentially evolving and changing and adapting and growing with the universe as time goes, is the golden path. Well, when he looks and sees what would have to be done, he is absolutely horrified by what he would have to do to make that happen. And so he forsakes his crown, and his son takes over. Big bunch of mumbo-jumbo about the son that makes him all special and weird. Not really relevant, but he gets the same power, sees the same thing. And by stint of his sort of disconnection from humanity through his birth, because he was born special, hence he was kind of born already detached from humanity with preternatural knowledge. Essentially, he was self-aware in the womb. He is then able to go through the same process his father did, gain the same prescience, see the same golden path, and decide, well, that's what has to be done if I have to enact a brutal, bloodthirsty, tyrannical tyranny to violently oppress the entirety of humanity, to teach them a lesson for literally thousands of years by extending my life with these weird space drugs. And that's what's going to get people to grow up, get their shit together, and be able to survive the shit that's coming, because they are not ready for what's going to happen. So be it. And so effectively he becomes the tough love father figure to counteract the storyline's previously matriarchal figure in a secret sisterhood of women called the Bene Gesserit.
Yeah.
and it just sort of plays out there. But I bring it up as this point of this is sort of what Machiavelli talks about. Like, even if you want to be a good leader, even if you want to be a just leader, even if you want to make sure that all the people are taken care of, and that includes all the people of the world, and you just want to usher in the socialist utopia where everyone's needs are taken care of, sometimes you need to break a few eggs to make an omelet, and you have to consider the viability of the omelet you're planning to make before you break those eggs. And I think too many people are far too rash in their assessment of the viability of their omelet, and thus the breaking of the eggs.
Well, that's, I've thought quite a bit about this. Telos, goal, destination. A lot of that, as it's played out historically, has been people who I think just have an affinity for certain ideas or conceits, and then they just kind of on a whim, due to emotional attachment. So in a nutshell, really, I think that's what happened in the early 20th century with a lot of these ideas and communism, Bolshevism. So just follow through with it. No evidence required, no falsifiability, no real consideration about long-term sustainability. But I see this across the board. People, they just want something. It's like, we want, I don't know, blue raspberry lollipops. Why? I don't know. It's just something, it appeals to us. So let's just do everything in our power to get there. I think that's part of it, that this understanding, and I'm not sure if exactly that's what you mean, but that's a sense that I'm getting at, is partly my interpretation, that if you want to achieve something, you have to have a very good understanding of the inner workings of that thing and where things may go or where they may not go. But I see humanity is just, especially recent decades and centuries, beset by a lot of idealism without the requisite evidence to back up the final product, so to speak. And that, okay, we've done this, things aren't that great, I guess we didn't think about it. It's kind of, you see this ongoing, it's a meme by now, obviously, in internet circles, but that wasn't real communism sort of thing. Because it's an ideal that can never actually be actualized, and it doesn't really matter to the people. I think human beings they don't like to think about the actionability of things and the actual consequences and the final product, and whether or not things are in concert with human nature. Oftentimes, it's just to have these wild wishes of what could be, perhaps in some alternative universe, that oftentimes don't map onto human nature and human limitations whatsoever. And then, instead of ending up with an omelet of some sort, there's just a bunch of shattered eggs on the floor and all the yolks everywhere, and you can't even do anything with it anyway. And if I were to have a criticism of human beings, it's probably this. It's like they have this ideal, maybe some sort of vague telos, and there's no explanatory power of how to get from A to Z and what that might entail, and is that even compatible with the way we are? It's sort of, we just have this goal and we're going to pursue it, and the understanding to pursue it's just not there.
I think what you're hitting at is sort of, see, this is where I bemoan the lack of historical education in the world at large, because I find it, I'm not sure exactly how to term it, I'm somewhat ambivalent in it, somewhat conflicting actually, that when people look at things like communism or socialism and they try to diagnose it as a modern problem, and they're not aware that throughout the entirety of human history, we've always had weird little fringe groups that have some utopian ideal and think they've reached the end of history, whether aspirationally or denigrationally, in the case of some of the insanity you got during the Black Plague. But it's always happened. It's sort of how an evolutionary process works. That's why I'm a little confounded when anyone's wondering, like, where does this insane, random, radical upheaval of the system come from? That's what we do. That's how we work out the best system. We're somewhat discordian and anarchistic at nature, but not as necessarily a way to tear down the system, but as a way to shake the dead wood off the system and ensure that it's on solid foundations. So, like, how humans have advanced throughout history has always been by trying to buck the trend, revolutionize things, and come out on top by upending the tables one way or another, politically, economically, militarily, religiously, ideologically, whatever that might be. And we've always succeeded by effectively letting it shake out. I think the problem that we're identifying on a modern scale is that previously, and why a lot of people aren't aware of it from the history, is that they were just side notes, because humans were not, we did not have the capability of multiplying our, however you want to exert your power. We've got all kinds of force multipliers that someone can take advantage of, and the degree to which humans can effectively collectivize, because any sort of interaction is some degree of collectivization, it gets harder and harder to isolate the bad strategies that people are attempting to allow them to succeed or fail. But, like, part of the reason why we've had the various I mean, this is how I'm seeing and how I'm interpreting history, is like, we're not seeing anything different with socialism and communism than we saw with the rise of mercantilism, with the rise of actual use of abstracted currency, whether through fiat or precious metals, but still it was an abstraction of value for the actual goods that one needed to survive and reproduce. So that's, I guess, I'm kind of rambling on at the point, but what I'm trying to really get at is just there is a disconnect from people's feedback into this overall system, and a lot of people can't even quite grasp that you can address some of these problems by adjusting the system. Hence, we kind of can't get to some of the root problems and talk about how the system itself might be flawed. They're just so ready to say, well, there's a flaw with capitalism, therefore capitalism's bad. And so they're just going to try to upend the system, but they can't upend the system and fail in isolation without taking the rest of us down with them.
Yeah. On a pragmatic point, you made some suggestions. So let's talk practically here. Well, it's not really practical since neither you nor I have a power to execute this, but sort of practically.
Yeah, it definitely should not have the power to decide who lives and who dies. I would do terrible things with it.
Oh, well, okay. Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
I have fully integrated my Jungian shadow, and I totally acknowledge I do not trust the negative impulses that I consider inherent in human nature to even risk myself with the temptation, and I will take what modest virtue I can try to claim by acknowledging that I should not tempt myself with such power.
I appreciate that abnegation of your potential there. But so we have this scenario in the United States in particular, but probably you could say more broadly in the world, but in the United States in particular, where we know automation is coming. We know there's an entire class of people that have been cognitively, socially displaced, all these things. And there doesn't appear, not many people are talking about it. You get Andrew Yang, say what you want about him, whether you think his solution is viable or not with the UBI. So, but at least he's talking about it, right? Most people aren't even talking about it. You had some interesting ideas on this stuff. What could be done? Obviously, this is a theoretical, but in terms of, let's say, there were the will, there were the way, there were people behind it with money and motivation. a way out of this automation and cognitive displacement trap for people. And I thought it was pretty interesting. I don't want to, spoil it from what I can recall, so I'll just let you lay out the groundwork there, maybe.
Certainly, if I'm picking up what you are throwing down,
Yeah.
I think you're talking about how time and again it has been shown that yes, AI can beat a human. We've seen that of games that we want to model, chess being the most prominent example that most people are probably going to be familiar with. Pretty much everyone acknowledges AI can beat a human. We understand that. There's no point in competing anymore. The chess community had its moral conundrum of whether or not they should even bother playing chess anymore, yada yada. They worked out, well, yeah, human competition is still interesting and engaging, and we'll just agree to leave the AI out of it. But then people got curious, like, well, what does it take to beat an AI on its own? And time and again, it's been shown that if you have a human player against an AI that is advised by another AI, so essentially the AI is providing its analyses of things, presenting the possible options to choose from, giving its opinion on the viability of the various outcomes, the human is able to add as far as I can term it, and this is where I get into somewhat heretical ideas on free will, if you want to get down that far, but if the human effectively then applies its much more complex pattern recognition and processing and decision-making tree to the filtered solutions that the AI presents, and they're able to beat the AI reliably. And so I wonder if, because we don't have a general artificial intelligence, like we're not anywhere close to developing an AI that you can just ask it questions and have it solve problems. We're even having a hard time getting an AI to understand the concept of some basic fundamental things. Like the premise of Isaac Asimov's three laws is just not possible because we don't know how to define human to a computer in a way that it can actually understand given input, not any useful metric, and not that couldn't inadvertently lead to it thinking like, oh, well, people with pacemakers and therefore no heartbeat need to die because we can just shuffle them off into the furnace. So what I think you're going to get is, as automation advances, you're always going to effectively need a human in the loop for, I would say, the foreseeable future of at least several centuries, most likely, if not in perpetuity. But you would be able to augment their capability by adding these AI advisors to help them make.
Sorry, you're cutting out.
Oh, I apologize.
No,
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're back. You're back. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I apologize. I think my push to talk might have slipped there. Let me possibly try turning that off. Then that shouldn't be a problem. I'm always wary of the voice activated. What I was getting at, if I was picking up what you were throwing down, and pardon if I am repeating, but my idea is that I don't think we're going to have as much of a problem with displacing labor and an unemployed workforce as we automate, because as we further automate, we're going to introduce physical automation that, yes, will put physical laborers out of work, but their capability as physical laborers, their knowledge, and the fact that we can train people with this in the coming generations can be augmented with an AI advisor to basically kind of bring them up to snuff, so to speak, to manage things. So even though they might not know jack all about robotics, they can have a heads-up display with an AI advisor that's hooked into all the sensors in the factory, and they can manage whatever factory full of robots, and if something goes wrong, it can walk them through the entire repair process.
I actually had meant something entirely different, but it's interesting.
Oh,
Yeah.
I apologize. What were you getting at?
The time you talked about sort of international exportation of labor sort of thing, we can get in that too, where people, I don't know, migrate to X.
Oh,
yeah, but
yes. My
but
counter to the various progressives and their idea of like, well, life is so bad afar, let's just import them here. And my argument of like, well, why don't we go
Yeah,
there
let's
and
get
help
into that,
improve
but
their
just to
lives?
address some of the. I mean,
Sure.
I'm not so sure I have that much faith in part because there's something about labor you brought up before where the best labor is meaningful labor. I mean, forget about the profits. The the workman or the carpenter who makes a table, that feels good. You're feeling the process. You're going through it all. I think even if one were to grant this potential vision that you've laid out, you you have an issue in the sense that the person is so detached from the inner workings of what's going on that he's just that guy who is pressing maybe some buttons. I don't know if that would be fulfilling. And we already have an inkling of that from the type of work a lot of people do, whether it's working in a factory where they just feel, as you pointed out, detached from everything. So that's one issue that might come up from that. And as far as, I mean, I guess it depends on how simple it is. The types of people at the lower end of the labor market that can't really function in the knowledge economy, maybe some of them could be trained, maybe not. It would depend on how complex the tasks are in terms of overseeing some with a HUD or something. I'm not so sure. I mean, I don't have that much faith in that necessarily, but maybe you can expand on that.
I would possibly put forth is a way to augment this idea, and something that's already being experimented with in industry currently is this effectively the gamification of work. And so you can effectively leverage the pre-built wiring humans have that I term it effectively, it can be quantified as a gambling instinct. We have a hardwired response to favor systems that provide intermittent reward, occasional risk for a jackpot payout. Like there's a reason gambling's addictive, and it's not because it has a physical component like heroin or anything. So
Right.
if you can apply gamification principles to such work, you can address the alienation problem by effectively making people feel like they're at a casino for doing their job.
Without
Hence,
the deleterious and negative effects of the latter. Yeah, yeah, that is actually pretty interesting. Gamify the system.
yeah,
Yeah.
here's your paycheck. And by the way, you're now a level 34 auto plant manager. Congratulations. In the time since you were last paid, you have helped produce X number of cars that have been sold to Y number of families. Congratulations. Everyone's very happy. Here's the various pictures on Instagram of people enjoying their cars. Don't you feel fulfilled? Here's your paycheck. Get back to work.
Yeah. Yeah,
It's
I
a little
think that
dystopian, Brave New Worldy, but oh well.
yeah, that could be a possible thing. On the matter, the one that you discussed earlier that I just brought up again, it's interesting. There's something about, in general, I mean, this hasn't always been the case, but many people from around the world, they come to the United States to quote unquote make a better life for themselves and what have you. And I could offer a lot of criticisms in that model, but it's funny that it never enters into anyone's mind that maybe we're at the stage now where people would have to quote unquote leave the United States to make a better elsewhere. And that's something that you'd brought up in the sense that maybe there are places in the world where X form of labor is still valuable and somebody could do something with that. But what do you think accounts for the resistance to the idea that somebody engage in some sort of exodus? Is it just the sheer difficulty of it all that I can't see? I mean, here's the thing: people talk about not having the resources. Okay, fair enough, but I mean, back in the day, the resources were even further and few between than they are now. So, what do you think is preventing? Because I think what you were referring is that maybe these displaced people, they they could move somewhere and just someplace where this labor is still required, or they could and just try to work out something there.
I hate to give you a non-answer of I think it's a really complex set of factors because there's a certain social and cultural inertia factor that plays in. You can hear it when Tucker Carlson is talking about the plight of the coal miners and, oh no, how could we possibly expect them to move from where their fathers and their grandfathers and their great-grandfathers have been buried? This is the land of their yada yada yada, completely ignoring the fact, like, I'm sorry, but the entirety of human history has been people uprooting it and going where it's better. I'm sorry that that's happening to your little nostalgic slice of Americana that you technically were never a part of, so you don't fully grasp what life is like down here, but you're pining away for some ideal that you can't even live up to, jackass, let alone expecting somebody else to live up to. It just completely goes against the entirety of human history. And I think with that comes realistically I almost want to cop out and say it's a lack of an entrepreneurial spirit, but even saying it's a cop out, I think you can get my opinion on taking such a stance. I think it's almost more people don't feel that there's a frontier there to be conquered, therefore it doesn't spark an entrepreneurial spirit. And you get that sort of deadened down with, unfortunately, a lot of socialist, communist, anti-capitalist rhetoric where I know a lot of otherwise capable people that could be very good entrepreneurs in a variety of fields that literally just have the mindset of like, why bother? A company like Walmart will just destroy me. Oh, if I just try it, Apple will just introduce that feature in their phone and I'll go out of business. Like,
You don't think it's
exactly
also
wrong.
maybe a factor of sort of American isolation, cultural or otherwise, where America, the United States, is a place you go to, but not a place I don't know, as a flee, but you leave, because obviously, if you're whatever you think about that poor guy from Guatemala, he's heading legally or otherwise heading to the United States. So clearly, other people in countries you could say less fortunate or certainly less, you could say, isolated, and I don't mean that physically necessarily, but sort of cut off from they have a will and an impetus to lead to uproot themselves if need be. But I can't help but think there's a huge cultural weight on people to leave that behind. Because maybe because it is hard, but I don't know if it's the difficulty. It simply doesn't come into their field of vision. And I'm wondering if there's this huge historical cultural weight in the United States that, maybe it's not the promised land. Maybe you can't, and to even entertain that, it's just not. We don't compute, basically. Yeah.
Well, I would hazard I think I would disagree slightly because I think what happened was a basically anti-American, anti-capitalist rhetoric became sort of the prevailing narrative for a variety of reasons that a bunch of people have a whole bunch of conspiracy theories about, and I'm not entirely sure which way it goes, but I'm not going to disagree with the results, which is somewhere along the line, and I think this plays back to the noblesse oblige we talk about, of the idea of going forth and expanding Western civilization and bringing it to other people because we actually thought it was a good idea and could improve lives, got twisted to, well, if you have any intention of going out and investing in a foreign economy to benefit that economy while also making yourself some profit, even if you're not exploiting them, is just generally deemed as sort of a moral wrong.
Colonialism.
Like, even as sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, and colonialism I don't think in the mainstream you could ever make an argument that would be acceptable that there were any net benefits to colonialism. It's purely exploitative. I think in the majority, in many cases, it was, but idea that no good came of it whatsoever seems a bit simplistic.
Yeah, and then that's kind of where I like how Brett Weinstein brings up how he sort of wishes people were more fluent in game theory,
Yeah.
because the conflict I see with the socialists is literally, it kind of is one of education, even though people might talk as more about, different value structures that are diametrically opposed and they can never be properly rectified because they're judging things differently. But part of it comes down to, you quite can't get through to these people the idea from game theory that, like, capitalism, if executed properly, as we all intend it's supposed to be, and we're striving to make it operate that way, is a positive sum open-ended game. And that means that the more players in the game improves the game for everyone. So going to a foreign country and investing in industrializing them, raising their standard of living, and giving them jobs in doing things we actually need done is a net good. And yes, while it benefits us, it also benefits them. But they're caught up in a zero sum mindset. Oh, if it benefits you, therefore it must be detracting from them in some way. And you kind of can't get through to them. Like, no, but this is a net good. Like, we're improving things. And they'll point to atrocities in history as some and they're kind of right. I mean, yes, there were problems, with the Dutch East Indies Company and Jackson and a variety of cases where this system got out of control and atrocities occurred. But this seems to be the system that mitigates those atrocities most, because prior to that, some pretty nasty stuff was done not in the name of capitalism. And capitalism seems to have, by every metric, stemmed a lot of that horrible violence and other atrocity and horrors that people had to deal with.
Hmm. Although, I mean, if I wanted to play devil's advocate, or not even devil's advocate, there's something, sort of an elephant in the room, and it's often brought up. I mean, if I were somebody, not necessarily, well, I don't even know what camp I'm in, but it seems to me like what you're saying is a bit of what some might call GDP rhetoric, right? Where so essentially the GDP is the metric by which you measure the health and wealth of society, and that there's something beyond simply something like that. There are cultural institutions. There are other factors that seem to tend towards erosion when you have a hyper focus on simply profit and quote unquote the capitalist dream. And there are factors in human contentment and happiness that are not captured merely in market systems, although they're obviously a huge part, just because existential concerns are a huge factor. I'm not so sure. I mean, it might just be that it's a kind of all or nothing game, that if you want to run that experiment where it's just about essentially maximizing profit and increasing living standards, you can all have that, but other things will inevitably, ineluctably be lost in the process, and we'll just have to accept that. That culture and other values cannot coincide with what I mean. Look at globalism. I mean, it's a boo word, but when I talk about globalism, what I really mean is, it's a type of monoculture that permeates basically any industrialized country that has access to the internet and all this stuff, where you get variations that seem culturally distinct, but it's not really. It's really continuity from start to finish, and that's just an inevitability of what happens when you do this. Maybe we just need to accept that. But again, the counter argument is there's certain things not captured in market systems that some people would argue are essential and very, very consequential to human contentment and thriving.
Well, that's sort of where I think they're part of how pervasive the communist and socialist rhetoric has gotten in society is, and I don't mean this as a dig, but like the very fact that you're even posing capitalism as being a profit driven system No, I take it that that's just a gross mischaracterization of capitalism, because ultimately capitalism is about having the ability to capitalize on whatever resources you can acquire to find a way to add value through your labor and trade that with others. Weirdly, this is why I get very frustrated in trying to discuss things with communists, because, like, I'm sorry, but communism is late stage capitalism. What is a commune but a corporation? A corporation is just that. It's a bunch of people getting together, just like they describe in a commune, writing up a charter on how they're going to cooperate and how they're going to labor together and divvy up the fruits of their labor. When you pin down a communist and, like, okay, so describe to me the nitty gritty details of how it works, they describe small corporations on a regional level. So, I guess I'm not entirely sure where I was taking this, but it's sort of how I see this issue when people bring up, again, automation or globalism. Is like, yeah, the market has problems. The market upsets itself. But the point being is that if you give people the capacity, the room to basically figure out how to mutually benefit each other, they're going to figure it out. That's what humans have done from the dawn of time. In the entire manosphere and tradcon and all of that talks about complementary nature between men and women, like that's the intrinsic nature of humanity, is try to figure out how to all get along to mutual benefit. We only tend to resort to conflict when basically we face an existential threat and there's not enough resources to go around. So I would contend that really what you're looking for from capitalism is not so much a profit-driven process, but more allowing people room to capitalize on whatever resources they can manage to get their hands on, and then let the profit occur because people are going to find a way to do something that maintains their standard of living to a degree they find satisfactory. And if you just let them do that, then some people will be satisfied living with less, some people will be satisfied living with more, but they'll be forced to be productive and beneficial to everyone in the process. And folks just don't seem to quite get that basic concept. And yes, profit-driven motives is what sort of destabilizes and leads to abuse of a capitalist system, a loss of noblesse oblige. And you end up with people being basically exploitive, like the socialists whine about. Like, oh, they're using capitalism, they're hurting people. Yes, unfortunately, that is a thing that can happen when you give people the freedom to bargain amongst themselves as they see fit. Sometimes somebody will screw somebody else. That's the price you pay.
I'm not sure. I mean, maybe we're talking past each other. I was thinking more about the erosion of distinct cultures. So I'd give you an example. One of the biggest economies in the world, the South Korean economy, it has a distinct culture that's evolved over centuries, millennia. This has been eroding rapidly. It has a we call neo-Confucianist culture. There's no real counterpart in the West. That's kind of dissipating. Some people think, well, that's a really bad thing. So because the system increasingly there is moving towards this global monoculture, where what's good for the American and what's good for this person here, and it's all the same. And I mean, it's not happening overnight, but there are social problems that arise due to that. The importance of, say, the family has disintegrated over time, and so I was more focusing on certain cultural aspects that used to enshrine things that made people feel a sense of social capital and value, and just feel like there's some substance beyond their paycheck, rather than some of the things you mentioned.
No, and I see, yes, I get what you're talking about. Yes, we were talking past each other a little bit. So to comment on your point there is, I see the concern you're getting at, but I would contend that I don't think we're so detached from nature and just existence as it is that we can properly have a monoculture. I think what we're noticing is a fairly violent negotiation on shared values, and various factions that previously did not have to intermingle to a degree that they do now are now having to effectively have that cultural debate or negotiation on how they can come to terms on a set of shared values. But ultimately, I do think there will still be difference, partly because environment is going to have a factor. Like, I don't, even if, a collapse happens, China takes over the world, and we all fall into a Chinese culture, there'll be an influence, but there's definitely going to be a difference because, Louisiana has a lot of swampland and Florida suffers the weather that it does. There's still going to sort of still be Louisiana and Florida, even if China's running the economy. So I think we're still always going to have some differentiation that way.
Oh yeah, I'm
territories.
Yeah, I'm not. I'm not really revealing my own power level here. I'm saying that that's an argument that you might hear. I think you get modification, and that's always been the case historically. That there's I don't know if people attach this myth that cultures existed in isolation for so long, and that there's something fundamentally new about the quote unquote globalist culture. Well, in some sense, it's true because you couldn't span 20,000 kilometers in the past in the blink of an eye, but functionally, things. There's always been interplay. There's been intermixing. There's been a lot of ideas. Western civilization is the confluence of many different ideas, not all of them necessarily even Western, if you want to talk about the Middle East and things, and maybe Persia. So it is more complex than that.
But I would say I see what you're getting at in this shakeout, because yes, we're both agreeing on there is a broader trend in history of the prevailing culture sort of swapping around based on whichever culture happens to have whatever is the most powerful thing at the time, whether it's a military, a navy, guns, money, whatever. And that just sort of swaps around. It's like, that's why we have the term lingua franca. At one time, the prevailing culture was French. Surprise. And then it was English, and then it was, and then it was. And what you're seeing now is sort of what you're describing is, in the past, you had these prevailing cultures that would sort of vie for preeminence amongst each other within their own little venue, and they were somewhat isolated from each other for a variety of reasons. Well, now we've expanded the system by which other cultures that previously didn't really have to interact to this degree are now having to interact. And prior, what you could leave up to ambassadors who could handle all the various social conflict and new taboos and faux pas that can happen and navigate that complexity. Now the common man in North England has to deal with it. And that's sort of where we've lost that sense of noblesse oblige, in that, yes, this globalism and globalization of the economy can ultimately work out to everyone's benefit, but the actual people managing such a thing sort of lost track of how to introduce it effectively, and they just sort of slammed on full speed ahead towards profit. Hence a flaw in the system that needs to be addressed, but not necessarily eliminated, and didn't really consider the effect they were going to have on the underlying foundation that's supporting them, that is the society they live in.
Right. Yeah.
Hence, they're further disconnected, like you've been bringing up. The elites are so disconnected from the laborers, they don't have a concept of what they're doing is actually a problem, because, like I was saying, the feedback they're getting is everything's A-okay. Stocks are up.
Well, and then there's a physical reality, too. If you live in a gated community in some fancy schmancy California, I don't know very much about the neighborhoods there, but I know they exist, these gated communities. They're effectively, you don't see Skid Row. It takes active effort to walk down to downtown LA and look at Skid Row, for example. Same is true of any major urban center, particularly in the U.S. You can. I've been in conversation with somebody from one of these bubbles recently, and it's. I grew up in New York City, but I'm far from wealthy, and he grew up in a completely different sector, and it's just even growing up in the same city, completely different worlds, perspectives, really didn't catch wind of a lot of things. And I mean, I'll be honest, I mean, but I'm not even exaggerating. The biggest problem essentially, him having to play golf with his father-in-law is going to pay for everything. That's a serious issue. Essentially, I don't really want to play golf with my father-in-law. Oh God, it's so much. That being an issue. But that's the level of so there's a wealth. The enormous wealth also creates a shield and a point of division, of that sort, where it's not just the stuff you mentioned. They're actual. You can, if you have your own community with your own stupid organic supermarket and all this other stuff, and you never need to leave it. Yeah, I mean, these are other people's problems, and they're not even. I mean, most of us on the ground would consider playing golf a luxury, let alone somebody paying for your session and the food accompanying that, rather than some great burden. I mean, sure, it's all relative, but that's the whole point. The problems there are just on a different scale. I mean, they're not really that problematic. And I'm not. I think we're at the point of no return. Really, I don't think. Well, maybe something could happen, but I don't see. I see that worsening over time, not improving. That disconnect. Yeah.
Yes, I would definitely agree in that regard, because part of my background, having sort of, I had certain advantages, yes, and opportunities, but it is very much coming from self-made. Like I went from being on my own at a rather young age to fend for myself to a career in IT, and along that path, I was encountering and having to deal with the emotional turmoil of leaving people behind because, for whatever reason, the socioeconomic strata that they're in, they just can't conceive of what it would take to get out of that, let alone actually follow through with doing it. And this is why I usually have a hard time, as much as I agree in theory and philosophy with the more right-wing conservatives on the economic model of, like, yes, we have a system that if you do actually put in some work and you do actually labor, yes, you can actually succeed, yada yada, but you have to already be at a certain level to enter into the game. And there's a whole strata of people that either they've fallen so far down the ladder they can no longer enter into the game. They're so dysfunctional for a variety of reasons that even if they might have the capability and resources to enter into the game, they don't see a game to play. And I think this is what you see a lot, at least in my experience, with the more fringe, like actual homeless kid Antifa type that are raging. They literally don't see a path out. You hear people talking about it in case of the inner city. And folks are really like, why don't they just get a job? Why don't they just do any number of things that are available to them? Because for some reason, they can't conceive of a path out. And you sort of get the reverse on the leadership side. They look down on these people, and because they are already existing in a socioeconomic strata that affords them resources and opportunities that are not available to other people, the quote-unquote white privilege, which, sorry, but this is what it is. It is a complex issue of, look, you're already starting off with a good enough foundation that you even have the option of taking advantage of some of these opportunities afforded to you. Other people, if you tell them, like, oh, learn to code, okay, well, they're a little busy surviving. They don't have time to take out 4 years, let alone 6 months, to learn to code. They're devoting 12 hours a day to getting enough calories to exist
or endure the horrors
shelter.
of playing golf with your father-in-law.
Well, and that's sort of what I'm getting at. Yeah, with the people that are enduring the horrors of playing golf with their father-in-law, is they're just so disconnected. They can't conceive that that's maybe not really a problem. But there's not a lot of sympathy to be able to have a conversation to give them that reality check, because unfortunately this is I have this debate with the communists and socialists, the classic rag they have on how landlords are parasites and they provide no value and we should just do away with rent and all the yada yada, housing's are right, blah 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 blah. And trying to have a reasonable conversation with them to highlight, like, no, the landlord's doing a job. Like, do you have any idea what it takes to own property? There's taxes to pay. There's paperwork to do. The work it goes into just going through the paperwork to acquire the property, let alone the money involved, is no small feat. And then they're also on the hook for the repairs. Anything goes wrong, you just call them. They come and fix it. Like, there's a lot of work that goes into being a landlord. And this is where I sort of get the point of, like, how the elite get disconnected is, in a weird way, the labor class pushes them away by thinking the leadership class, the elite class, isn't actually doing anything.
Oh, I'm not making that claim at all.
I am. That's what I'm saying. Is that I think that's sort of what it's.
Yes, people. You're right.
Back and forth.
I've heard. Yeah, it's like the CEO isn't doing anything. I've heard these arguments a million times. He's not doing as much as this manager doing this down here, and sure. I mean, I'm not denying that things are getting done at the top, and there's a lot of competence up there as well. It's just what I'm really, I guess, hyper focused on is just that dividing line, which you mentioned. Some people are actually trying to struggle to make ends meet so they can put enough food on the table, and the other guy's problem is, oh God, I might need to drive extra 20 minutes to go to a proper bakery to get a cake for some outing or something,
And that's where I think the disconnect, as you're identifying, is perpetuated and worsened in both directions. That neither side can properly talk with the other because there's a whole bunch of baggage and misconception about what the other side's doing.
Yeah, I think that really is the crux of the matter, and it goes both ways. At the bottom end, there's I think the overwhelming perception is that the elites are just, there's something fundamentally pernicious, maybe even malevolent, certainly not well intended, that they're not actually doing anything, which is obviously bogus, and they're from the disdainful bubble elites. It says, oh, they're just lazy, stupid. Some of them are stupid, but they're just lazy. They're worthless. They're icky people, and increasingly, though, and this is the problem with the socio-economic stratification, that the middle class, I mean, people talk about it, but it is dwindling. Although I suppose, given all the luxuries and amenities of the current year, what do you even define as middle class? But still, and I guess the difference, I mean, I would put the cutoff line as actually having to budget your life a little bit and think about bills and even be concerned about that. I think that's still a middle class concern, almost certainly. But when you move past that, then you're entering into this other dimension. And let's be honest, from the bottommost rungs of society, where whether it's welfare checks or struggling just to literally eat every day if you're homeless, to the point where you kind of worry about certain bills, you need to budget things. That's a lot more people than this tiny fraction of people who are, who are ticked off about playing golf with their father-in-law or pastries.
Yeah, they're kind of effectively retired, even if they're going through some motions.
Yeah.
It is basically akin to meeting with a financial advisor to be told how much money their money has made this quarter.
Yeah.
As opposed to what I might classify as the upper working class. And the distinction there being is upper working class is that upper limit of, if you stop working, you're fucked. Maybe 6 months from now, maybe 2 years from now, based on your savings, but you can't retire just yet. Your money is not making money for you in a survivable manner.
Yeah. And I don't see it because it's not, you have plenty of smart people in the middle class, who are far from wealthy, that they need to budget and do all these things, and everyone not in that group, they're just essentially considered icky and just something else, like a different species, virtually. And I think increasingly, this is going to lead, I think, long term to bad. I mean, for one thing, a lot of this obviously, led to the Trump election. I think he'd probably get reelected. And then on the other end of the political spectrum, you're probably going to get a lot of super idealist people, socialists, whatever you want to call them, term them, that will push back and turn. And nobody seems to want. There's a guy like Charles Murray, he talks, but nobody really wants to even attempt to bridge the gap of some kind of common humanity, because for all the reasons we've discussed, there's no incentive structure there. And as you point out, there don't appear to be problems. If you live in, I think he called it Belmont, this sort of fictitious, turned out to be not fictitious, town, Belmont, in some place where everyone's just doing fine, and your biggest issue is that the lawn cutter arrived 5 minutes late. Yeah, I just don't know how to get past this, and I think it's going to get worse and worse and worse. And you could, no matter how much despair occurs and how many people end up, checking out early or whatever, these are just going to be like, I liken it to these faux concerns about, child labor in Africa. Does the average American actually care about some distant guy who's 8 who's slaving away to mine coltran or gold or whatever, or tin? No, not really. And that's really what it's become. These are things you read about in a newspaper. The drug problems and things like that. It's and I don't see any way at this moment with the current trajectory any way around that, and past it rather.
I'm maybe a little more optimistic than most in this, philosophical sphere that you are a figure in that I'm not so sure that we're going to have a collapse that...
I wasn't suggesting, okay, I'm not saying, it's going to, no, I'm not saying that. I think what I'm saying, because I think maybe it's my own inarticulation here, that I feel like I'm just not driving my points home, and we're kind of talking about separate things. I'm not sure. I'll assign blame to myself. I'm old and tired and probably significantly dumber than you are. But here's the thing. What I'm trying to drive home is not a collapse, that we're going to have a long-term downward spiral that may never, it'll go on for decades and decades and decades of people checking out early, of worsening life outcomes, and it will get worse, and there'll be maybe headlines in newspapers, entire towns checking out early and whatever, and people will be saying, that's really interesting, like they read about that conflict in Angola at some point in time. That's what I'm referring to. Not a collapse, but just continued indifference, apathy, disdain, and just looking at these people. And by these people, I mean everywhere up to, as you pointed out, the upper working class that needs to still keep on working to get by and maintain some standard of living, which is going to be the vast majority of people, but de facto, that will continue, and it will be as if you're reading about child soldiers in Africa or whatever. It'll be some interesting tidbit, and you will get on your merry way. I don't think there'll be a collapse. I think the system is very efficient in continuing on its merry way, and the people who are suffering the most will be suffering more, and the people doing well will continue to do well, if not better. And no, I'm not seeing a collapse. It'll just keep on going, and there's going to be a lot more misery as a consequence.
I suppose maybe that's where difference of vocabulary for saying the same thing, because I would term that a soft collapse, but that's a form of collapse because it's a decline into some sort of degradation and lesser standard of living and effect previously. But this is where
I guess my inner supervillain comes out, and I have to say, like, yep, sometimes the economy contracts because of technological advancement.
Hmm.
And, like, that's how evolution works. Sometimes people can't keep up and they get left behind. Now, that sounds very cruel and brutal, and by no means is a solution of, like, what do you do with these people? But in a certain regard, if they're checking out, thank goodness they're resolving the problem with minimal collateral damage.
Fair
But
enough.
I do see your concern there of like, ooh, this is a really messy transition and could probably be managed a hell of a lot better if
Mhm.
someone with the power to do so would wise the hell up and actually start exercising some properly deliberative noblesse oblige and manage this
Well,
transition.
I
Like
get
you were
your
getting
point.
me to talk about before, of like, hey, how about we enact a economic policy where we encourage, rather than off like trying to figure out how to increase jobs in America, we help subsidize businesses going overseas, shipping American workers overseas to help expand the economy of these other areas.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, how should I put this? Yeah, I mean, from an evolutionary perspective, sure. I mean, I don't know, we can't prognosticate about the future this far in, but so you could almost say that maybe it'll be some population bottleneck. But I guess my concern is the numbers here are just too big. This isn't just, you know, because of the nature of our society, economy, the advancements made, when I mean, I hate to use we'll say 90% of the population is not doing well. I mean, sure, that's happened before, but much smaller numbers. It won't be as simple as just. And here's the thing: regardless of whether or not these people think they're dependent on these people or not, there are still extant interdependencies. And when you have an entire population that is fundamentally dissatisfied, not doing well, um, checking out early, et cetera, that will have a ripple effect long term. And even if you don't give a damn about these people, and I suspect it's obviously elites don't, um, if you ignore it long enough, it's going to come knocking at your own door. I mean, I hate to use the term a zombie apocalypse. Only these people won't be zombies; they'll be real people, and I don't think they want that long term. They could be completely selfish about it. We don't ever want to smell a hair on this person's head because he's not using the right deodorant. But eventually, the problem will come knocking at their door if the numbers continue to multiply. And it won't just be poor; it'll be middle people, maybe even upper middle class people at some point in time. We can call that a soft collapse, but this is why I think it's such an important issue to address because I don't. The evolutionary perspective captures it somewhat. You get population bottlenecks, and then whole generations die out, and obviously all species go extinct. But this is a little bit different because there's so much technology and just civilization appended to it, and so the numbers are just so big that I'm not sure if you know, you can do the mathematics as you did and be content with that. I mean, obviously, it was a very calculating thing to say, and I get it. It's technically true. I'm told that all the time. Actually, as somebody, MGTOW, it's like you're doing everyone a favor. Yeah, you go, don't reproduce. You just die off. That's good. Now I hear that all, and they're technically right. I mean, I don't, they're right. Still, I'm just one person. I'm talking about untold millions of people, and I'm not sure if that's a good
Yes.
outcome.
No, I'm with you, and that's where I tend to contend with the noblesse oblige conscious leadership position of it's probably a heck of a lot better by every metric I can imagine to figure out some way to transition the broader populace into the new economic model, whatever that might be. And I would contend, and this is what I'm not trying to present it as a counter, but more I'm seeking input for a possible scenario I'm trying to work out. Because previously, all of these bottlenecks that we had,
were typically accompanied with some either room to expand, so the technological revolution that was destabilizing the economy would otherwise leave people to die because they couldn't keep up. They could effectively leverage their, for no better term, more primitive skill set by conquering the frontier that could later then be expanded by an industrialized economy. Or we were suffering from some sort of disease. Like, I see merit in the hypothesis or the premise that the Enlightenment happened because we survived through the Black Plague. It upset the economy, increased the price of labor, forced us, all that stuff. So I think I would contend with, all right, we had previous problems with effectively what World War II was. It was a similar, well, the economy's kind of meh, and one way to resolve that, like throughout history, is to go to war. That's typically what would happen when you have these situations. You'd go to war. But I'm wondering if we might not be effectively in the late Roman bread and circuses or Aldous Huxley Brave New World scenario, where effectively the variety of entertainment media that is available to people will act as an effective soma and effectively placate humanity.
I've said this
transition.
absolutely. I don't think they were talking past on this point. Yes, I've said this, that the difference between the late Roman Empire, for example, and a current is that there's only so much you could do. Gladiatorial games, you need import animals, you needed volunteers. I mean, I wouldn't say...
And they weren't happening all the time.
Yeah.
We have entertainment on literally 24/7 tap.
And it's near infinite. You can, whether it's the type of pornography you want to check out, everything exists. And look, I'm not an exception here. I'm undeniably super hyped about Cyberpunk 2077 from what I've seen, because I think it'll be a game changer, and it'll maybe set a new trend for 5 or 10 years in terms of gaming.
It has introduced a new meaning for my existence.
Yes. Yeah, same. So here, I mean, so we're all part of that. But the point is that, that's why I think people, I don't want to, because I have limited time, but, people talk about, monetary, this and that. Sure, the fundamental difference, I think it's an important drive home, is most people aren't starving in the West, even if they're not doing well. And they have access to the internet. And even if you don't want to play on PC, which I encourage you to do so because consoles suck, you still have your console, and you can, pop in whatever it is you console people do and do that. The entertainment is near endless. And so, you can, as you put it, keep on some, people are going to be anesthetized to a lot of this in a way that wasn't the case in the past, because resource deprivation, abundance was not, was always, questions of abundance were always a thing, rather. Baseline. Are you going to get past your baseline? No. Okay, we're gonna get behind the National Socialists. We're gonna do this. That's not people. It's shit food, but you can get go to the supermarket and buy a whole bunch of Dorito bags, and at the very least, you're going to meet your quote unquote caloric needs for cheap. And then you can play God of War, apparently, which this stupid console exclusive on PS4, and reasonably cheap. You one-time purchase, and it lasts for a couple of years. And you don't need to tweak it. I think this will just continue for quite some time to come. In as much as you want to call it a soft collapse, it's going to be so gradual that it'll be virtually imperceptible. It'll just be this thing that people continually observe. Maybe this town dissolves a bit more in terms of its social functionality, but yeah.
And see, that's where I was getting to is my premise being is that such a decline is natural. I think you're identifying a trend that we have seen elsewhere in history. But then I would contend is also elsewhere in history, you see effectively the reaction to such a slow decline into essentially cultural euthanasia, so to speak, is this process that eventually at some point the natural entrepreneurs, to put a very poor label on what I'm trying to identify, will have no choice but to introduce a technological revolution. And that technological revolution upends the current system and effectively introduces a new frontier. Like, once we conquered all the physical frontiers, and we effectively have, because, sorry, we're not colonizing space, we're certainly not going under the ocean anytime soon. So we've effectively got all the frontiers squared away for the most part. And there's no homesteading, really. I mean, you kind of can, but it's a long, complicated process in most jurisdictions. So what you're going to have is like what we see now. It happened with Rome. There was a slow decline, but then something is going to happen coming out of that. There will be a slow decline, a general contraction of the economy. You'll have a technological advancement, and I would point to maybe the introduction of the printing press, because
that was
technological advancement has always trended towards the democratization of power by however, any way you might want to term power. Please go ahead.
I gotta contest that, because I was thinking, we just briefly talked about Cyberpunk 2077, and the more I think about it, because I used to play, not much, I was more of a D&D guy, but I know we're both sufficiently antique here. So yeah, Cyberpunk 2020, that vision is, I think, increasingly one that might be accurate. That yes. The printing press. See, here's the thing: we got to be very. We have to differentiate here. Yes, the printing press was absolutely a force for the demos, for the people, long term. I mean, first it was not. Overall, yes. But there's a difference here, because when we talk about social media, all these technologies that exist that you as an expert know a lot more than I do about, we see the trend of kind of the opposite. We see people working hard at developing algorithms that manipulate people's psychology. All these things were not extant. They were not, I mean, people try to manipulate through words, sure, but it was not the same thing. I think we're moving more and more to a Cyberpunk 2077 scenario more than anything else, where it sounds a bit gay and cheesy, but yeah, where corporations, however you want to term that, but people get a sense of what that means, are rule everything. And life is quote unquote good, but that's the veneer, and underneath it there's just the deepest pit of despair. But it's sustainable because the baseline requirements for sustenance and existence are covered. And that is kind of the vision I have. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I typically am just detached from these good or bad judgments, but I think that's going to continually happen. And you're right. In a scenario where you get things like augmentation or body modification, I'm not saying that's happening anytime soon, but maybe gene editing would be the next logical step. That creates essentially a new form of technology, unprecedented, and who knows the exact detail of how this can work out. But I don't think that you're going to see the same democratization process you saw in the wake of the printing press revolution, which took a while anyway, because even in 19th century Europe, depending on the area, you still had something like 80 to 90% of the population being illiterate. This is different this time.
But I think what that point that you're bringing up with the population being illiterate is what I'm getting at, of how the technological revolution can help migrate a population to a new economy, or an economy that is able to leverage a new power that's been democratized. Because on exactly that point of people being illiterate, okay, now the printing press is available, people could publish stuff. If you had the capacity to acquire reading material and be able to consume that reading material on your own, you had a natural competitive advantage. People that didn't have that, well, you could carve out a niche in the economy of effectively acquiring and dispensing that information to them, but you were now a filter for that information. So these people that were illiterate and now at an inherent disadvantage in this system, to the point where it eventually got to the issue of they literally could not compete. Like, an illiterate person was no longer able to function in the economy, but they were allowed to effectively be softly migrated out by basically finding work for them to do and augmenting their capability, in this case by having, like, because you'd hear back then, you would have like the person who could read would take a pamphlet down to the tavern and read it to everyone for all the people who couldn't. Well, if they read a pamphlet before they read it to everyone else and they didn't like what the pamphlet had to say, well, now they're at an advantage. They have information the rest of the people don't. Oh, okay, but the rest of the people are still able to function in the economy. They're just going to be slowly winnowed out. And I think that's what you're going to see with further technological advancement, is as people try to use the technological revolution to lock things down and gain control, the very nature of the technological revolution means they're going to fail, and all it's going to do is help improve the system that ultimately takes over. Like, that's why I'm kind of glad that we have people attacking YouTube and PayPal and getting them through with the system. It's the same premise of, like, what is God's gift to the zebra, the lion? Is we're now able to identify, got it, we cannot design a video platform this way, we can't manage our payment processing this way, we have to redesign the system to be able to deal with these sorts of attacks. And fortunately, we're able to do it now before there's guns and bombs involved. Right now, it's just a bunch of worthless pseudo-journalists preaching about their ideology that they never actually had to put into practice. Hopefully, they'll go bankrupt before they cause too much damage and we can get back to business. And then this is where I have had to relegate my moral structure to the ethos of the bodhisattva and the teacher, because I quickly determined early in life that, like, my moral structure and attitude on things is not acceptable by any stretch of the imagination. Apparently, I'm a horrible, monstrous supervillain, because what you
I
describe of
detected
this
some adumbrations of that during the talk, so to speak.
Well, yeah, this cyberpunk dystopia that everyone considers so terrible by just the name terming it dystopia, I don't see a problem. I kind of want that world. I want the democratization of power to the point where existential threats can enter into business negotiations, because I think part of what's screwed up business negotiations is now it's no longer an existential threat.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, I think the issue is I'm not overly attached to this vague concept of human or being or humanity. And everything's a trade-off. I don't think they're ever solutions. So, yeah, I mean, when people talk about things being dystopian, I think it's almost universally something that veers away from their idealized vision and what they envision as sort of the ideal human being is, and what society for as a human being. I'm on board with, whatever version of it, be it Deus Ex, pushing the envelope. I think that, well, it's an inevitability in some sense. When it happens, to what degree? The Luddites lost ultimately, because people get on board with this stuff. People get on board with technology because it makes their lives easier. There is I think, a loss, and maybe that loss is incalculable, culturally, otherwise, of some sort. Things go under, things disappear in that technological wave, but I guess I'm somewhat more. I have a more conventional moral compass than you do, and so I suppose I'm more concerned. I can look at the macro picture like you can, because I can see what's happened in the past and say, okay, yeah. But I suppose I could distill it to this. My own view is that life is short and filled with suffering. Suffering, so I would like to reduce that for as many people as possible if I had that power. To the extent that I personally still cling to life, it's predicated on my ability, in the lives of some individuals I interact with, my ability to reduce their suffering. I assign no value to my own life whatsoever. So it doesn't rub me the wrong way per se. I get your perspective, but I still think that this transition should be stewarded in as compassionate a way as possible.
Okay, I feel you there, because I have been and I perpetually struggle with existing exactly where you are, because much of my existential angst and my personal struggle with existence and deciding whether or not checking out was a viable option given the state of the world is trying to come to terms with, and this is where again I hate to go back to like my pathetically encyclopedic knowledge of sci-fi, but in philosophy it's laid out
lauded,
as
not pathetic. But yeah.
I could have spent my time learning actual facts, but in philosophy the idea of the constrained theory of existence, or the constrained idea. And I'll point to folks in the audience, if you're familiar with Babylon 5, the premise the Shadows were proposing of an existence of conflict as a way to improve the various species, and to the idea of they would help the species grow by pushing them into conflict, so they had to improve and the strongest would survive. Versus what the Vorlon were proposing, which is, no, we will help people improve by being caretakers and shepherds and teachers and all that. In Dune, it's what Leto II had to do to enact the Golden Path, is in a metaphorical sense, the Bene Gesserit were acting as humanity's mothers. And that worked all well and good for several millennia, but humanity has now reached a point where it effectively needs to mature and needs an actual paternal figure. And that's the role Leto II takes on. And what the goal of the Golden Path is to effectively teach humanity a lesson so deeply entrenched, in his terms, it is etched into their bone. The idea that peace equals death, and you have to accept that the only viable strategy in life is to accept that there will be conflict, and sometimes that conflict will be existential. And if you can acknowledge honestly with yourself and your competitors when a conflict has to be existential, then you can more easily engage in any conflict that is not existential. Like, I find this often in business. Weirdly, I was more comfortable negotiating business deals with criminals because, weirdly, there was a certain guarantee there of, like, we could shoot each other. Like, that's a viable negotiating tactic in this situation, is just shooting each other. And knowing that context and having that bound of, like, I know exactly how bad this could go, weirdly kind of facilitated the negotiation, because when people would say, like, I can go this low or I can go this high, you sort of took this, like, I can't really push the issue. I'm going to have to trust that they're not screwing me. But in a negotiation where you don't have an existential threat and you're trying to minimize conflict because you don't see conflict as a beneficial process for resolving any sort of problem, when you have opposing ideas on what the solution should be, you kind of screw up the entire conflict. And that's sort of what we have. Like, as lovely as it is that capitalism says, fantastic, everyone can compete in ways that is not an existential threat, and therefore we don't have to expend our resources on things like maintaining our own private militias and armaments, protecting each other, and, like, we can delegate all of that to this police force, this government that we will vote in. Okay, that's great, but now you've kind of upset the balance of, like, previously, if I could just shoot someone, if that was a viable tactic, like it would be in nature, I'm not necessarily condoning violence, I'm just trying to identify the system and how it works. If I could just shoot someone because they were dumping crap in the river that was killing my tribe downstream, I could do that. If I was terribly dissatisfied with the working conditions, if somebody developed a product that was seriously deadly, I could go shoot them. If they didn't follow through with a contract, I could hire a mercenary army and go invade their country and take things over. But when humans are trying to avoid conflict, they can't properly recognize the sort of conflict they're in. And so I think by removing the reality of an existential threat, people now completely misjudge what actually is an existential threat. And
I would
so you
agree
kind of
with that
have
to
this
some degree,
overreaction now.
but at the same time, these things, it's a continuum, and you need equilibrium. Constant conflict, contrary to popular belief, is not good. It's not productive. All you're doing is fighting and surviving. I mean, it's the difference between. So, for example, we know from the archaeological record, among other indices, that violent murder went down when humanity transitioned from hunter-gatherer populations to agriculture to city-states. And, we know what happened as a result of that. Civilization kind of got off the ground. So violence and conflict certainly have their place, but it needs to be tempered. And I'm not so sure if it's not overly simplistic just to say, look, I agree, maybe existential threat could be a motivator. Maybe it could be an impetus, but
possibly to temper that is to make it clear, like part of what Leto II's project in the Golden Path was not to drive people to be in continual conflict, and that's certainly not in any way what I'm proposing. What I'm trying to get at is the premise in the story was getting people to mature to a point that they understood competition can be useful. And knowing and accepting that sometimes conflict can be useful and beneficial, you can then enter into the conflict more consciously. And you can negotiate terms of the conflict with the other party. You can actually begin consciously applying game theory by acknowledging we're playing a game, we're all players in the game, and we're going to negotiate the terms of the game. Hence, rather than just this sort of ingrained programmed response that people have now around like business dealings, where they're not even aware that like an existential threat could be a possibility in business dealings. Like if you tried to explain to them how the Venetian princes did business and that sometimes assassinating your business rival was a viable strategy and there wasn't a rule of law to prevent you from doing that, and thus it was a thing to contend with in negotiation, hence why you didn't screw people over too much. They could literally kill you. If, not saying that has to be introduced, but giving people a perspective of, look, let's understand the terms of the conflict we're trying to enter into. Let's understand how bad things could get, what's really on the line here, and let's understand that, look, we're just trying to haggle over trading some iron ore and refining it. We don't need to get terribly cutthroat about everything. Let's save the cutthroat for when there isn't enough food to go around, okay? Fantastic. Now let's negotiate like gentlemen.
Yeah, I suppose, I get the distinct feeling that you would do very well in that existentially risky system, and others might not, but it's understandable. I mean, we tend to favor systems in which we work well in.
Well, that's where I like I said, I deemed that I should not be making moral decisions for anyone, and I definitely should not have a leader role because I'm fairly amoral about things. I'm almost entirely pragmatic. I'm just concerned with the results. What is going to most efficiently get me the desired results?
Yeah.
And quite often in any civilized system, behaving well within the system is going to get you your results. That's why there's sort of a disconnect and problem with anyone. I mean, under most systems, I'm totally realizing, yes, you get a terrible oppressive system that fucks you up and sets you on a path of failure and all that, but for the most part, the system we've got now kind of functions reasonably well if you just take part in the system.
Right.
I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's by no means a matter of, well, I better buck the system and be a bad actor because I have no choice. I have sympathy for the people that feel that way, and I understand how they can fall down or be disadvantaged to a point that they have no other choice. But that's kind of what I'm getting at is I think we can, as a society, more effectively discuss and address this problem we have where, yeah, sometimes economic conflict for some class of people is nothing more than the flip of a coin. Oops, I lost out on that deal. I didn't make all the profit I could, or I didn't get that contract. Oh well, I'm just going to go play golf with my father-in-law again, darn it, and I'll find another contract to make money off of. Or I don't even need to. I got people for that. They'll go find another contract, and they'll figure it out. Versus the people that in economic conflict is an existential threat. And if we can get people to wise up and understand, like, look, guys, sometimes the person you're negotiating with, they're not just a lazy socialist. Sometimes they're somebody who literally cannot figure out how to feed themselves and or their family. How are you going to deal with that? And if you can't acknowledge that this is the conflict you're in, that you are basically deciding what you're going to do for the next 6 months based on the contracts you sign and all of that, these people are trying to figure out how to survive. And that would completely change the negotiation if people could properly assess and accept that, acknowledge it, like actually feel it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I would concede based on the things you said that that's not a standard moral compass. I'm certainly a pragmatist too, but I think a lot of this is just born out of natural intuition. I feel, again, I'm not entirely amoral, and I'd like, if possible, to somehow mitigate these things, even though I can certainly see the merit, and we're probably drifting in that direction, of some kind of paradigm shift, at least for a certain period of time, that might push things in a different direction. With that said, I'm kind of out of time on my end, and it is fairly late where you dwell. So I'm going to thank the audience for joining us, and thank you to Mr. Coyote for some interesting and novel ideas, and a very nice Dune lesson, because I was really rusty. I read it years ago, and even then I was not a Dune expert, so...
Thank you for having me, and I'm happy to come back if you're ever interested.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. And to the rest of the world, you take care. Have a good morning, afternoon, evening, or night. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.